Portland woke up to a mystery. 11 abandoned churches and temples, 11 silent bodies and no visible identity. White masks, extinguished candles. There is no blood, no message, no signature. Only a carefully choreographed void, meticulously positioned ropes, and a memoryless camcorder form a narrative without an author. While authorities try to understand the pattern, criminal investigators discover something disturbing. The victims were not watching a ritual. They were watching what was supposed to be at its center. A center that never existed. And across an entire city, someone is reconstructing the space where their identity was erased piece by piece, until nothing remains, not even the self. Paisanen. Portland wakes up on a strange Sunday, not yet knowing that scattered throughout the city and its most forgotten outskirts, 11 abandoned churches hold exactly the same silent scene. Motionless bodies, white masks, and the sense that someone tried to turn emptiness into ritual. The first call comes to 911 shortly after 6 in the morning. A group of urban explorers decides to film content in an old wooden church near a secondary road, half swallowed by moss, half by graffiti. They expect to find dust, broken pews, maybe some old symbol. Instead, they find the image that will repeat itself, almost like a stamp, across the entire city. Inside that first church, the air is still, saturated with cold wax and a faint smell of moisture mixed with something metallic, subtle, distant. The main hall is dark, but the center of the space is highlighted by a circle of extinguished candles arranged with almost mathematical precision, forming a boundary between the sacred and the staged. In the middle of the circle, there is nothing. The emptiness seems intentional, as if the center of the ritual were precisely the absence. Around it, bodies. Some kneeling, hands relaxed at their sides, heads slightly tilted as if in silent devotion. Others sitting on broken pews, all turned in the same direction, as if they were watching something that is no longer there. Two of them, leaning against a side wall, standing, their backs aligned, as if they were guardians of a ceremony that never took place. All of them, without exception, have a thick, rough rope wrapped around their necks. And all of them wear rigid, entirely white masks, with no drawn eyes, no mouth, no eyebrows, no trace of individuality. The masks are not ordinary. They have no visible openings for expression, no ornaments. They are smooth, too smooth, as if they were chosen to deny any possibility of recognizing who is underneath. From the front, they form an almost hypnotic set. 11 white surfaces pointed in different directions, but all equally empty. It is a faceless congregation, assembled to be seen but not immediately understood. A little ahead of the circle of candles on a simple metal tripod stands a camcorder. The equipment is positioned with precision, aimed exactly at the center of the circle, as if it were supposed to record a specific moment, maybe a speech, maybe a vow, maybe a final act. The lens, now turned off, points at nothing. When one of the first local officers checks the equipment, he notices something crucial has been removed: the memory card. The camera is a blind witness. It was there, but it was deprived of any record. As patrol units start arriving, the police radio explodes in a sequence of similar calls, almost as if an invisible pattern were revealing itself in real time. Another church in a peripheral neighborhood, abandoned since the 90s, with shattered stained glass windows and piled up pews. The same configuration: extinguished candles in a circle, camcorder on tripod, white masks, bodies arranged in positions that evoke worship, audience, and vigil. In a third location, a small brick chapel by a riverbank nearly hidden by trees, faithfully repeats the same scene. With each new report, the feeling intensifies. This is not an isolated crime. It is choreography, a narrative staged on 11 different platforms under the direction of a mind that is not improvising. It is executing a script. In some churches, the floor reveals subtle marks, lines of displaced dust indicating that bodies were dragged or positioned carefully. The knees of some victims are slightly marked, not by graphic violence but by prolonged contact with the hard floor. It is as if they remained in that position for a while before the final outcome. In others, there are chairs aligned, all turned toward the empty altar, with one victim seated in the front row, mask facing forward, body still tied to the chair by a rope that serves not only as an instrument of death, but also as structural support for that pose. There are no signs of chaotic struggle. Objects are not scattered, pews are not overturned, walls are not marked by impact. The usual disorder of an impulsive attack is absent. What exists there is something else. Organization, staging, absolute control of the setting. The violence seems to have been integrated into the ritual, not as an eruption of hatred, but as the logical conclusion of a process. The first forensic specialists entering the scenes notice details that stand out. In one of the churches, on a pew, there is a small group of yellowed pamphlets announcing an old spiritual study group. But among the old papers, something more recent appears. A modern flyer with clean design, light colors, and a promise in bold letters. Start from zero. Erase your history. Reset your identity. The material seems out of place in that abandoned setting, as if it had been brought there intentionally. In another scene, a notebook is found at the feet of one of the victims. In the first pages, there are generic motivational phrases. In the last pages, confused scribbles, repeated words, silent pleas for relief, as if the author had shifted from hope to exhaustion without anyone noticing. As the day progresses, the local media begins to sense something far beyond a single crime. Helicopters fly over parts of the city trying to capture images of the abandoned structures, but the interior scenes are blocked by police. Reporters speak of disturbing discoveries in multiple decommissioned churches. Unofficial sources whisper about masked individuals found lifeless. The rumor begins to gain almost mythical contours even before any official briefing. An unknown cult, a pact, a collective suicide. But the details don't align with such simple hypotheses. It soon becomes clear that among the 11 victims, there are variables that challenge the idea of a single group deciding to die together. Different ages. Different clothing styles, though neutral. Some wear casual pieces, others slightly more formal attire. There is no ceremonial uniform. The only truly common element, at first glance, is the white mask and the rope around the neck. But as the first identifications begin to emerge, a deeper pattern appears. All these people, at different points in recent years, gravitated toward groups that sold the same central idea: being reborn by erasing everything one is. Killing one's identity symbolically, to rebuild it from zero. Digital files, hastily checked, begin to reveal curious patterns. Registrations for contemporary spiritual retreats, reprogramming workshops, total emotional cleansing gatherings, online communities preaching the need to undo one's name, history, past, memories, in the name of a new life. The same discourse wrapped in different packaging. Kill the ego, silence the inner voice, dissolve the self. More than one of these victims was, at some point, willing to be reduced to an empty beginning. At the scene of the fourth church, one detail triggers a strange sensation in local investigators. On a side wall where a religious painting once hung, only the 4 nails remain. Hanging there now in place of the old image is a piece of white fabric, smooth, without symbol, without anything printed. It is just a rectangle of absence. Below it on the floor, one of the victims sits, mask lifted in the direction of that cloth as if watching a projection that does not exist. In another location, a small note is found folded inside the pocket of a victim. It contains no instructions, no justification, only an incomplete phrase, written with irregular handwriting pressing into the paper. If I disappear, at least. The sentence ends there, without a period. The rest was torn off or never written. Once again, the theme resurfaces. Interruption, silence, identity split in half. Forensic photography technicians document every detail of the scenes before the bodies are removed. Every extinguished candle, every body position, the exact distance between the tripod and the circle, the height of the rope knots in relation to the floor. Everything is measured, everything cataloged. What at first glance looks merely theatrical begins to be treated as language. Whoever is responsible is not just killing people. They are organizing symbols, constructing messages with visual elements. A circle of candles that should illuminate but is extinguished. Masks that should hide faces but instead level everyone into the same emptiness. Camcorders that should record but were muted by removed cards. Nothing there is accidental. By the end of the day, Portland is no longer just a rainy city with an alternative aesthetic and an intense cultural life. It is a map of points connected by something that still has no name. 11 abandoned churches, 11 masked bodies, 11 stagings using the same symbolic vocabulary. On the upper floor of a precinct, the first photographs are printed and spread across a large table. Seen from above, the white masks look like small islands of silence within dark spaces. The pattern is undeniable, but the mind behind it is still an unknown territory. The local authorities quickly understand that this is not a common case. This is not just multiple homicides, nor a pact among followers of an obscure doctrine. What's present is a psychological discourse encoded in setting, posture, and object selection. It's not enough to investigate who died and where. It's necessary to decipher why everything was constructed in that specific way. Behind the scenes, the first calls begin. Someone, somewhere in the chain of command, remembers a specialized unit, one not focused on physical traces, but on mental ones. A discrete division created precisely for cases where crime seems more like symbolic manifestation than a spontaneous act. The initial idea is simple. If this killer, or this author, is telling a story using bodies, masks, and silence, they need people who know how to read thoughts, behaviors, and patterns as if they were scenes from a script. But for now, all that exists is the image that won't leave the minds of those who entered those churches. A congregation of faceless people, arranged as if awaiting a revelation that never came. A theater of erased identity. And somewhere, someone watched this happen, and took the only card that could prove what really occurred between the lighting and extinguishing of the candles. Part 2. When the call finally reaches the MINDTRACE Division, it does not arrive as a dramatic alert, but as a silent, encoded document sent to Dr. Liz Murray's desk at 4:17 a.m. A digital folder with 11 photographic files, 11 preliminary reports, 11 location maps, and above all, a final note underlined by the Portland Police Department. The scenes appear to follow a psychological and symbolic pattern. Erased identity, choreographed ritual, need for advanced behavioral analysis. Dr. Murray reviews the material with the attention of someone who knows mental patterns speak before words do. She focuses not on the ropes, not on the rigid arrangement of the bodies, but on the masks. White masks, smooth, completely devoid of identity. Each one becomes to her more than an object, a manifesto, a sign of the author's intention. She immediately summons the team's two main analysts. The first to arrive is Agent J. Carter, a specialist in neurobehavior and cognitive architecture of crimes based on symbolic narrative. He looks at the images in silence for long minutes, a habit most interpret as coldness, but that Liz understands as his way of absorbing every nuance of the scene, the distances, the contrasts, the interruptions. Jay does not ask who did this, but what kind of mind could conceive this? Shortly after, Agent Mark Henderson arrives, a specialist in symbolic reconstruction and field reading. He tends to interpret scenes as if they were stages, lighting, body positions, direction of objects, the sum of spatial elements. For Mark, every spatial detail carries emotional significance. The mask is not just a mask. The extinguished candle is not merely absence of light. It is a choice, a statement. Liz presents the raw material without dramatic interjections. The MINDTRACE team is not trained to react with shock, but to decode. She organizes the images on the main monitor and begins the briefing. The 11 churches are distributed around Portland like vertebrae of a symbolic spine. They do not form a circle or an obvious design. But something draws the attention of the three. The distance between each church does not seem random. There is emotional spacing, not just geographical. Jay notices quickly, All are located in areas historically associated with loss of community identity. Neighborhoods that faced abandonment, social displacement, collapse of old spiritual or community groups. Places where people sought, for decades, some kind of rebirth. Liz summarizes. The author chose empty temples, places where the self had already dissolved. Mark agrees. He sees coherence. The killer does not want to create a new ritual. He wants to expose the collapse of old ones. What is being represented is not faith, it is its ruin. The extinguished candles reinforce that. If they were lit, they would illuminate something. Extinguished, they reveal only the interrupted intention, the aborted ideal of personal transformation. The camcorder without a card is the next point. Jay analyzes. Removing the card is denying record. It's saying, what was done to me, no one saw. So what I do now, no one will see. Liz adds, or it's saying, it doesn't matter what you try to record. What truly erased me was never filmed. There is something deeply symbolic in the absence of the memory card. The denial of official narrative, the rejection of documented history, the erasure of the witness. The camcorder is there as a reminder of a promise. The promise that the ritual would have a center, something to be seen. But the center is empty, and the record was removed. It is a silent scream against the idea that his suffering could be translated into video. As the three analyze, the initial reports begin to arrive. In them, the first information about the victims confirms the pattern. All, at some point, sought radical methods of emotional reconstruction in communities, retreats, or organizations, promising to erase trauma, identity, and past. Liz reads with a low but firm voice. 11 people who, at some point, volunteered to be no one. Jay adjusts his glasses, thoughtful. That makes them perfect victims in the eyes of someone who sees the dissolution of the self as a crime. He believes he is finishing the process they started. The idea hangs in the room like an invisible weight. The killer is not simply killing. He is completing a distorted rite, concluding the symbolic death of identity through literal death, understood by him as the inevitable consequence of that kind of doctrine. Mark lifts one of the photos. In it, 3 bodies are seated, all oriented toward the same point, an empty altar. He doesn't want the victims to tell something with their bodies. He wants them to occupy a symbolic place in a narrative he lived. There is silence. And in that silence, the team knows this is the kind of case that cannot be interpreted on the surface. Liz finally concludes the technical briefing. There are no signs of improvisation. There is no haste. There is no signature of pleasure in the violent act. There is symbolic coherence. There is ritualized repetition. There is intent to communicate. And there is, above all, hatred aimed at an idea, not necessarily at the people. At last, she reads what she considers the central point of the case. The author is someone who tried to be erased, someone who lived through a process of extreme depersonalization. He is not killing individuals, but what represents the erasure of self. The MINDTRACE Division immediately understands this is not a random mass crime. It is a psychological manifesto, built with dramatic precision and deep internal pain. Every extinguished candle, every featureless mask, every removed card, everything points to a mind trying to rewrite its own story through others. When the briefing ends, Liz gives the final message, the one that defines when they go into the field. We won't investigate masks. We'll investigate the soul that needed them. The team is ready. Portland awaits them. Part 3. The arrival of MINDTRACE in Portland happens under a heavy sky, where the light seems to hesitate before touching the ground. It is a cold morning, and the city's typical humidity wraps everything in a dense veil, as if even the weather understood the symbolic nature of the case. The team does not start with the bodies. It starts with the silence. That is where the first answers are found. The MINDTRACE investigators' initial analysis follows the basic principle that guides the division. The scene speaks before any physical evidence is processed, and this scene is a complex discourse about erasure, fragmented identity, and a pain that organizes itself rather than explodes. The first step is to define what Liz calls the dominant emotional vector, the emotion that sustains the crime, not the one that follows it on the surface. For that, the three spend hours reviewing photographs of the 11 churches. They don't look at them as isolated crime scenes, but as chapters of a narrative. They quickly notice something essential. These are not execution scenes. They are representation scenes. The author did not choose to hide the bodies. He did not abandon them at random. He did not seek complete isolation. He placed them in functional postures, watching, kneeling, keeping vigil, composing. Each body has a role in what appears to be a negative liturgy, an anti-ceremony built from fragments of beliefs that once tried to shape his mind. Jay observes the repetition of the white masks and makes the first technical remark of the analysis. To him, identity is a manipulable object, something that can be removed, replaced, or nullified. The mask is the synthesis of everything he endured. Mark adds, with symbolic precision, and it's also the punishment. He gives back to the victims what he believes they accepted voluntarily, the renunciation of their own face. The team then focuses on the spatial architecture of the crime. Each church features the same basic structure: circle of candles, camcorder, empty center. But the arrangement of the victims varies. This suggests not improvisation, but adaptation to the environment. The author understands space. He responds to the place and incorporates its imperfections into the ritual. This indicates a highly visual architectural mind with strong narrative ability. And there is something else: the empty center. Liz analyzes the symbolism with the calm of someone who deciphers not objects, but pain. In rituals, the center is always the focus of transformation. Here, the center is absence, not presence. He is saying that the process that destroyed his identity had a hollow core. He prepared himself for a revelation that never came. The empty center is a scream of frustration, a promise of healing that was never fulfilled, an altar of silence. The tripod reinforces this element. The fixed framing, aimed millimetrically at the emptiness, suggests that the killer wanted to record the absence itself, or record the moment when something, for him, should have happened, but did not. The removed card is the final denial of someone else's narrative. Nothing that destroyed him was properly documented. No one told his story. So he removes the possibility of any narrative about what he does now. Jay summarizes it technically. The removed card is the boundary between memory and erasure. He is symbolically redoing what was done to him. They then move on to the second axis of the analysis: victim selection. And here the case takes on even deeper contours. The 11 people, different in age, social class, professional background, and appearance, converge at a single psychological point. All were vulnerable to discourses promising symbolic annihilation of the self. Kill the ego, reset the mind, start from nothing. All sought leaders, alternative therapies, or belief systems that promised purification through the renunciation of identity. This means the killer does not choose based on vulnerability, but based on a shared past, a past he sees as the original crime. To him, the victims committed the primordial error. They agreed to be erased. Liz understands this immediately. He doesn't kill out of direct hatred toward the victims. He kills to repair something in his own narrative. They are broken mirrors of himself. And this realization opens the third axis of the analysis: the author as a survivor of deep psychological violence. MINDTRACE has already investigated criminals motivated by trauma, but there is something different here. The killer does not express disorganized rage or a need for chaos. He expresses something pedagogical, almost doctrinal, though distorted. He tries to demonstrate, through the positions of the bodies, the masks, and the absence of light, what he feels he experienced: the systematic dissolution of subjectivity. Mark analyzes the extinguished candles and formulates the central hypothesis. The extinguishing of the light represents the abrupt end of a process that was supposed to illuminate. He saw himself fading out instead of lighting up. The author is not celebrating the ritual. He is denouncing it, and at the same time replicating it in lethal form. Jay explores the issue of dissociation an element present in the initial profile. The crimes are carefully staged but emotionally distant. He organizes symbols but does not connect effectively with the victim's suffering. This suggests a functional dissociative state, a division between planning and feeling. The team then reviews preliminary information about movements that erased identities. There are common patterns: renunciation of the name, use of neutral clothing, repetition of mantras, sensory deprivation, elimination of painful memories through pseudoscientific techniques. All this forms a historical line of psychological manipulation. MINDTRACE understands that the killer likely went through these stages, but at an extreme intensity, leading him to the collapse of his internal structure. It is here that Liz identifies the central piece of the puzzle. He's not running from the past, he is correcting the past through the present. That sentence changes the trio's perspective. The killer does not act to hide something, but to expose something no one saw. In that sense, the abandoned churches are the perfect choice. Spaces originally created for spiritual revelation, now hollow, deteriorated, silent. Places where the promise of healing turned into echo. The team analyzes the forensic reports and identifies additional details that reinforce the author's symbolic mind. In 2 churches, the distance between the tripod and the circle of candles was exactly the same, 2.8 meters. In 3 of them, the kneeling bodies were aligned with a precision that could not be accidental. In all of them, the masks had the same type of strap, indicating production or acquisition in bulk. But it is a discrete detail that truly draws attention. All the victims were oriented toward some kind of absence: an empty altar, a removed painting, an abandoned pulpit, a space where something should be, but is not. It is as if the killer were saying, "You looked for an answer that never existed. I'll show you what was really there." Nothing. MINDTRACE understands. The crime is not just physical. It is philosophical. It is emotional. It is metaphorical. It is a desperate attempt to give back to the world the feeling of emptiness that destroyed him. At the end of this initial analysis, Liz defines the central axis of the case. We're not dealing with a ritualist. We're dealing with someone who lived through a ritual that took him apart from the inside. He recreates the exact structure of his fall, but now as the author, not the victim. And finally, she concludes the preliminary diagnosis of the mental pattern: dissociative disorder as a survival mechanism, brief psychotic episodes, yet guided by symbolic coherence, extreme need to regain agency, hatred toward the concept of erased identity, construction of a personal narrative through crime. The team is ready for the next step: to reconstruct the crime, literally and symbolically, to understand not only what happened, but what was being represented in each gesture. Part 4. The reconstruction of the crime for MINDTRACE is not just a chronological reenactment. It is the attempt to enter the author's mind, following the invisible trail of his decisions, from the first movement to the last. In this case, more than ever, every movement, every choice of location, and every minute spent inside the churches reveals an intention. The killer did not improvise. He choreographed. And to understand him, the team needs to unravel this choreography step by step, layer by layer. The process begins at the first identified church. The team enters the place in absolute silence, respecting the atmosphere the author likely felt while preparing the space. The floor still exhales fine dust, mixed with the cold dampness rising from the old boards. The circle of extinguished candles remains intact, preserved by forensics. The camcorder, although turned off, points statically at the empty center. And the marks on the floor, small, almost imperceptible, still tell the story of the bodies being moved. Liz, Jay, and Mark do not walk like conventional investigators. They stop in corners, observe the angle of the shadows, mentally calculate the distance between objects. The reconstruction begins with the simplest and at the same time most profound question: how did he enter this place? The back door, partially warped, shows subtle signs of recent use. The lock was not forced. This suggests that he chose churches with naturally vulnerable entrances, with no need for force. This detail reveals something essential. the author does not want to waste physical energy. He needs to be whole to prepare the staging. Forcing doors is not part of the ritual. The ritual demands control, and control begins at the entry. Once inside, the team imagines the killer stopping for a moment, observing the empty space, breathing in the musty air, recognizing the emotional architecture of that place. For a mind that has suffered depersonalization, abandoned churches represent an internal mirror, empty places where one was always meant to find something greater, and nothing appeared. He did not choose functional spaces. He chose dead spaces, and that matters. Jay mentally calculates the movement zone. To position 11 different victims in 11 different locations, the author needed rigid planning. He did not improvise on sight. He arrived at the building already knowing exactly where each body would be, kneeling, seated, standing, composing with the altar, with the wall, with the center of the hall. Mark observes the distances. The kneeling body is aligned 1.8 meters from the circle. The seated body is positioned with millimetric precision in relation to the camcorder's axis. The body leaning against the wall is half a hand's width from the point where the bricks start to change texture. None of this is random. Each position responds to what he felt inside that specific environment. It is as if he absorbed the emotional characteristic of the place and, based on that, arranged the final aesthetics of the scene. The reconstruction shows a crucial psychological pattern. He does not repeat exactly the same arrangement in all the churches because he does not want to replicate the trauma. He wants to reinterpret it according to how the space inspires him. The next question is inevitable. How did he bring the victims here? There are no signs of struggle, no violent dragging, no marks of intense resistance. This indicates that the victims arrived alive and conscious but emotionally submissive, paralyzed or resigned. And that is the most disturbing point. This is not about physical incapacity. It is about an induced psychological state. Liz analyzes the collective behavior. He recreated the group sensation they already knew. People who have been through processes of identity erasure respond automatically to figures of symbolic authority. He didn't bring them as a kidnapper. He brought them as an inverted leader. This insight forces the team to consider a fundamental element of the crime. The killer reconstructed the group dynamic that destroyed him, but now in the dominant role. The victims, conditioned by previous experiences of emotional submission, may have followed instructions without grasping the real risk. They may have believed they were participating in some kind of cathartic ritual, not an execution. This explains the absence of disorder. To them, everything made sense, until the very last moment. The next question: when does he tie the ropes? The analysis suggests that the ropes were placed after the victims assumed their positions. None of them show marks of struggle against the material. The fibers do not present irregular tension, indicating that the author maintained psychological control over them until the final minutes. They were emotionally immersed in the staged ritual. He played the role of guide. They accepted it. Mark highlights a technical detail. The ropes were tied with the same knot in all scenes, a simple, functional knot that he likely learned in some ritualistic context. This reinforces a known pattern in survivors of severe spiritual manipulation, mechanical repetition of learned gestures. He did not invent the knot. He reproduced it, like everything in the ritual. The team then moves on to reconstruct the central moment of the crime, the instant when the candles remain extinguished. That choice says more than any other. Candles are symbols of illumination, renewal, rebirth, revelation. But here, they are dead. It is the symbolic refusal of light. It is the denial of the promise of healing. It is the killer's emotional manifesto. He did not find light in the ritual that destroyed him. He found emptiness. Liz touches one of the extinguished candles without lighting it. He didn't want to create a ceremony. He wanted to expose a ceremony. The team then shifts to the camcorder. The tripod, always positioned on the same axis, 2.8 meters from the circle, indicates that the author wanted to record something very specific: the absence of transformation. The empty center is the focal point of all the scenes. He creates a visual expectation that is never fulfilled. No central object, no figure, no symbolic revelation, just emptiness. And then he removes the card. Jay interprets this gesture with technical precision. He performs a ritual but refuses to record it. That means the ritual is for him, not for the world. The temporal reconstruction suggests that each crime took hours, not minutes. He waited. He watched. He let the environment speak to him before acting. Time is part of the ritual. There is no rush in someone who wants to relive his trauma in a controlled way. The final step of the reconstruction is the exit. No scene shows signs of a hurried escape. He does not try to erase footprints. He does not try to mislead. He simply leaves. This reveals a mind that does not fear being found. Or more precisely, someone who believes the meaning of his act will only be understood by those who know how to read what he is saying with symbols. It is at this point that Liz formulates the synthesis of the reconstruction. He did not commit 11 crimes. He reenacted a single traumatic experience, divided into 11 versions. Jay adds, each church is a chapter of the same memory of erasure. Mark concludes, and each victim is a piece of a mosaic he is assembling, not to hide, but to explain. The reconstruction is complete. Now, the team knows not only what he did, but how he did it, and why he did it that way. The next step will be even deeper, drafting the psychological profile of the author. Part 5, building the psychological profile of the author requires MINDTRACE to go beyond behavioral analysis. It demands decoding the pain. For this team, profiles are not caricatures of criminals. They are mental maps of someone who lost their internal structure and is trying to reorganize it through the external world. In this killer's case, the central point is not just suffering. It is the collapse of identity, followed by a desperate attempt to rewrite what was destroyed. Liz begins the process with a technique she calls the fracture line of the self, a method that identifies in each action of the criminal which part of his identity is trying to manifest. To her, the first characteristic is obvious. The author is someone who lived through prolonged psychological manipulation. He didn't merely participate in a group that preached the erasure of identity. He was subjected to the most extreme versions of that discourse. All elements of the scenes point to this past: the white mask, symbolic renunciation of the face, the extinguished candles, aborted promise of illumination, the empty circle, absence of revelation, the camcorder without a card, denial of his own story. Each component is a visual sentence of a trauma experienced. Nothing is improvised. Nothing is decorative. Everything communicates. Jay advances the analysis with a fundamental premise. He doesn't kill to destroy the victim's selves. He kills because he believes they've already destroyed their own selves. He completes the process. This is the key. The killer sees his act not as aggression, but as resolution. For him, these people had already submitted to the same logic of erasure that destroyed him. And in his fragmented mind, he believes he is merely finishing the ritual that began in them. It is correction, not attack. This type of rationalization is typical of individuals who have suffered extreme depersonalization. They spend years, sometimes decades, fighting to recover even a minimal sense of existence. When they fail, their suffering reorganizes itself into narratives of symbolic repair. The crime, to them, is not impulse, but liturgy. Mark observes another critical point. The author does not act out of pleasure. There are no traces of sadism, eroticization, sexual control, or macabre exhibitionism. There is no narcissistic signature, nor indicators of pride in social impact. On the contrary, if anything, he prides himself on nothing. He merely fulfills an internal script. This indicates that the killer is dominated by a psychic structure composed of 3 pillars. 1. Functional dissociation. He alternates between 2 states, the executor of the ritual and the emotionally detached observer. When he acts, he does not access the victim's emotional dimension, only their symbolic dimension. He sees them as elements, not as people, as extensions of the places he chose. 2. Episodic interpretative psychosis. It is not a permanent psychosis. It is intermittent, activated by specific triggers, symbols, words, abandoned spaces, discourses of rebirth, or anything that recalls the doctrine that destroyed him. In these episodes, the author reorganizes traumatic memories as if they were mandates. He believes he must correct the world because the world did not correct what was done to him. 3. Scar of depersonalization. This is the deepest mark. People who undergo identity-erasing regimes develop a distorted perception of their own value. They feel like objects, manipulable mass, voices without authorship. The white mask not only represents what he was forced to be, it represents what he never managed to stop being. The crime attempts to break this cycle. He places the mask on others, as if saying, "Now you carry what you carried in me." Next, Liz evaluates what she considers the core of the author's psyche, his hatred for the concept of null identity. It is not just anger at doctrines or gurus, it is hatred toward structures that exploit emotional fragility to convince traumatized individuals that the path to healing is to destroy themselves. This hatred is the fuel that transforms memory into ritual. This point reveals another important characteristic. The author believes that disidentification is a greater crime than murder. He sees his own pain as proof of it. To him, killing is not destruction, it is interruption. Interrupting the process of total erasure. Interrupting the cycle. In his mind, he does not kill people. He kills symbolic states. Jay analyzes the victim selection and identifies a pattern that to him is the most disturbing. The killer chooses people who continued seeking reconstruction despite having suffered deep losses. He sees them as accomplices of the same ideology that destroyed him. He perceives them as voluntary participants in a process he lived as violence. In his interpretative psychosis, these people are not victims. They are agents of the perpetuation of an ideal he wants to destroy. Mark analyzes the body positions and sees there the manifestation of a mind reorganizing chaos. Seated, representation of learned docility. Kneeling, representation of induced submission. Leaned against walls, representation of artificial vigil. These postures are not humiliations, but distorted reflections of the positions he himself was put into during moments of intense psychological manipulation. He is replicating structures of control, not to control, but to exercise. The author also demonstrates a strong pattern of narrative control. He does not destroy the environment. He does not create visual chaos. On the contrary, he organizes, aligns, balances. His movements are meticulous because his trauma was meticulous. Nothing was spontaneous in the process that destroyed him. Nothing is spontaneous in the process he reenacts through the crimes. Another key factor of the profile, deep inability to externalize guilt. He does not accuse individuals directly. He does not write manifestos. He does not leave notes. He does not speak to the world. He does not want to convince anyone. He does not want attention. He does not want applause. His gesture is closed, intimate, almost introverted. It is an internal dialogue turned into an external scene. Finally, Liz articulates the psychological nucleus of the author. He is someone who lost the self and decided to become the last voice that remained. His search is not for death, but for meaning. He kills because he didn't find meaning in surviving what he lived. And then she concludes, "We are dealing with a survivor of symbolic erasure who regains his agency by destroying the ritual that consumed him. He does not see victims. He sees pieces of himself." The profile is complete, but with it comes an unsettling certainty. He is not finished. People who live under the domination of internal narratives do not end a cycle before representing all its chapters. He still feels there is something left to complete, something missing. One last symbol, one last scene. MINDTRACE understands that the killer's next move will not be random. It will be inevitable. Part 6. When MINDTRACE believes it has clearly outlined the psychological functioning of the author, the first contradictions begin to appear. Not contradictions in the killer's logic, but on the surface of the case. Disturbances that seem to point in different directions, and that the team must examine carefully before discarding. For traditional investigation, These clues would be promising paths. For MINDTRACE, however, each one has the potential to be only the shadow of something the author wants to be seen, not what truly matters. The first false lead appears when local police find, in one of the churches, an almost imperceptible mark on the wall, an incomplete circle, apparently made with soot or charcoal. The mark, only a few centimeters wide, has a small opening at the bottom, as if representing a ritual symbol. External specialists begin to speculate that the killer might be linked to esoteric groups, occult orders, ancient silent cults. The presence of candles, masks, and ceremonial positioning seems to support this superficial hypothesis. But for Liz, this is a diversion. She observes the symbol for long minutes and concludes, "This isn't symbol, it's gesture." The incomplete circle is not a signature nor a ritual mark. It is the trace of a hand resting on the wall, perhaps during the movement of a body. It communicates no message. It communicates fatigue. It is human, not ideological. The team eliminates the lead. The second false lead emerges with the camcorder. A technician identifies that 2 of the 3 models found at the scenes are often used in independent video productions and artistic short films. This creates a brief frenzy. Could the killer be someone from the audiovisual field? A frustrated filmmaker? An experimental artist obsessed with symbolic critique? For Jay, the answer is immediate. He doesn't film. He silences. If he were an artist, he would leave records. He doesn't want to create image, he wants to deny memory. With that, they discard the hypothesis of an aesthetic motivation. The camcorder is a totem, not a tool. The third false lead involves one of the pamphlets found at the scenes. In 2 churches, while digging deeper into abandoned old materials, one of the local agents finds fragments of old brochures about self-transformation, with minimalist icons and motivational phrases. One of these fragments contains the expression, "Congregation of Nullity," a name that, at first glance, seems like a direct clue, perhaps even the name of a group the author once belonged to. But MINDTRACE discards it quickly. Mark points out, "The design is amateur. The language doesn't match the level of psychological manipulation we've analyzed. This is trash left by someone years ago. It doesn't belong to the author." The team is not swayed by grand labels. The killer does not need names. He is his own doctrine. The fourth false lead is the most dangerous, and because it almost convinces. At a community center in East Portland, an anonymous citizen hands the authorities a notebook that he claims belongs to a total rebirth movement, a modern spiritual group with techniques resembling some of those experienced by the killer. The notebook contains drawings of faceless figures, phrases about inner reconstruction, and instructions for exercises meant to empty identity to reach a kind of transcendence. At first glance, it is almost perfect. It is so perfect that Liz steps back immediately. It's too perfect, too structured, too articulate for someone who lived real erasure. The notebook contains doctrines, yes, but clean, didactic, carefully designed doctrines. The killer lived the opposite. He lived the reverse: chaos, emotional loss of control, disorganization of consciousness. The material does not reflect trauma, but modern spiritual marketing. Then Jay notices something important. The killer doesn't use written language, he only uses spatial symbols. He would not leave a notebook. Lead discarded. The fifth false lead arises in digital analysis. Technology agents identify that one of the victims frequently searched for topics like spiritual emptiness, awakening of inner silence, and de-identification exercises. This could indicate that she was part of a specific group, perhaps dangerous, perhaps clandestine. But when cross-checking data, analysts realize her searches were recent, weeks before the crime, and carried a tone of desperation, not doctrine. She was looking for help, trying to feel something again. She wasn't following a group, she was emotionally imploding. The lead does not point to the author, it points to the victim's suffering. The sixth false lead involves the possibility of multiple authors. With 11 scenes so carefully executed, local authorities consider the hypothesis that the killer might have accomplices, perhaps 2 or 3 individuals with shared backgrounds, members of a fragmented doctrinal community. MINDTRACE rejects this immediately. Mark clarifies, "The choreography isn't shared, it's intimate, it's singular, it's one mind repeating one pain. If there were accomplices, there would be variation, divergence, behavioral contamination among participants. Here, everything is too coherent to be collective." The 7th false lead is more concrete. Footprints found in 2 of the churches seem not to match. Sizes and shapes suggest that more than one person may have walked there. But analysis reveals something simple. Some victims wore large shoe sizes. The movements recorded near the bodies are only the result of the final positioning carried out by the killer. The lead dissolves. The 8th false lead, however, is the most treacherous. A supposed survivor. A woman approaches police claiming to have participated in a retreat with characteristics similar to those described by the victims. She reports having been emotionally pressured by a supposed spiritual leader and believes he may be behind the crimes. She provides a name, a location, even an old photo. While local officers rush to locate the potential suspect, Liz asks for silence. She reads the woman's account carefully and identifies something crucial. Her discourse is testimonial, not traumatic. She experienced manipulation, but not erasure. She doesn't carry the central scar of the author. She is projecting fear. This isn't a lead, it's an echo. And then, in the analysis room, something becomes evident to the 3. None of these leads is the path. They are all shadows of the same category, noise from a world full of false doctrines, false guides, false promises. The killer is not among those who promote themselves, not among those who write, not among those who form communities. He is among the erased, among those who lost not only identity, but voice. The conclusion MINDTRACE reaches is unsettling. The author didn't leave false leads. The world did. The modern spiritual noise is so loud that the truth hides because it resembles the chaos around it. When they finally discard all parallel hypotheses, the team realizes the scenes contain no diversions, no distractions, no traps. He operated with total symbolic transparency. This means only one thing. The killer's next move is already underway, and it will not be noise. It will be revelation. Part 7. The crucial discovery does not appear as a sudden spark, but as a slow shift in focus. A moment when what once seemed static suddenly reveals a subtle movement behind the shadows. MINDTRACE works exactly for this moment, the point at which the crime, until then composed of silent symbols, finally speaks. It all begins when Mark returns to the first church the team visited, not to review evidence, but to experience the spatial sensation again. He positions himself where the killer likely stood the longest, behind the camcorder. That is where the author observed, waited, felt. He tries to understand what the killer saw when he stared at that circle of extinguished candles. What was he looking for? What did he want to witness? It is in this instant that the first detail reveals its importance. The empty center. It is not merely absence. It is the exact point toward which all the victims look. All scenes converge toward the same nucleus, nothingness. Mark realizes something. The center isn't empty. The center is the author. This insight makes him step back. The killer placed the void as the protagonist because, to him, that is how he felt. The center of a ceremony that promised revelation and delivered nothing. Each victim, in different positions, is turned toward the place where he should have been transformed, but where he was instead destroyed. When he shares this with Liz and Jay, something aligns perfectly. Jay formulates the thought. He doesn't recreate the ritual he suffered. He recreates the position he was in. And Liz adds, and this time he watches what he never saw. People looking at what he became. This is the first critical point. But the true discovery is still only halfway there. The second piece emerges when Jay revisits details of the ropes used in the crimes. The texture is identical, but a microscopic pattern catches his attention. A repetitive lateral wear that suggests all ropes were stored on a single roll or structured spool. not purchased individually. The mark isn't from the factory, it's from continuous use in a single piece of equipment. That equipment is not found in the churches, nor in the victims' homes, nor nearby. So where is it? Jay realizes there is only one type of place where a spool like this would be used repeatedly in processes involving human activity, controlled environments, and light physical manipulation. Workshop centers, retreat spaces, community installations used for experimental practices. And then everything clicks. There was a place, a physical space, a center where the killer experienced the erasure process. A place that used ropes, white masks, ritualistic lighting, symbolic submission exercises, pseudo-therapeutic practices. The killer is not only reproducing the emotional structure, he is reproducing objects, materials, and devices from the place where his identity was broken. Mark then reorganizes all the measured distances from the churches, the constant 2.8 meters between tripod and circle, the repeated alignments of candles, the symmetry of bodies. These numbers are not random, they are spatial transcriptions, replicas of something that already existed. Based on the patterns, he drafts a hypothetical layout of the first room where the killer experienced the original ritual. It is a symbolic exercise, but deeply technical. And when he overlays the 11 drafted layouts, something striking emerges. All variations converge toward the same base structure: a rectangular hall with a low altar, a central circular space, and a frontal observation area. This place existed, and MINDTRACE needs to find it. But it is the third piece that finally ignites the revelation: the masks. Liz notices that all masks were exactly the same model, a resistant mold, without contours, texture, or expression. They were not bought online, nor produced by an artist. They are identical to those used in depersonalization exercises of contemporary doctrines from the early 2000s. Masks meant to help participants dissolve the persona in symbolic practices of psychic rebirth. Groups of this kind existed, but many were dissolved, investigated, scattered, abandoned. Most of these organizations left behind empty buildings, forgotten storage rooms, abandoned churches, warehouses, retreat houses converted into spiritual workshop rooms. And then the final key turns. One of the victims worked as a volunteer building manager in a property that years earlier had been rented by one of these extreme psychological transformation groups. That building was in Portland, in a neighborhood that is now nearly deserted. And when the team cross-references old coordinates, 2008, 2011, 2013 with property records, the map reveals a common point: an old identity rebirth center called the Hollow Path. The name is too symbolic to be coincidence, and the place's history is equally revealing. It was a site of intense psychological immersion, promising total dissolution of the self in 3 days of practice. The location was shut down after reports of emotional abuse and deep manipulation. The main facilitator disappeared after the investigations. Documents were destroyed. Participants scattered. And then, the full revelation detonates in the room. Jay states what all three already know. He isn't just reliving trauma, he's rebuilding the temple that destroyed him. Liz adds, and the churches aren't religious choices. They're spatial echoes of the original place. Mark concludes, he's going home. The killer did not choose 11 churches by chance. He chose 11 spaces that together recreate the emotional architecture of the center where his identity was annihilated. He does not kill people randomly. He kills inside memory. MINDTRACE understands that if the author is reconstructing what he lived, one final step remains. One last room. One last act. And that act will not take place in an abandoned church. It will happen where everything began. Part 8. The confrontation is not born from pursuit, but from inevitability. MINDTRACE knows this even before reaching the final location. When they track down the former installation of the Hollow Path, the realization is not one of surprise, but of silent confirmation. He would return there. He would always return. The cycle he was reenacting could not end in abandoned churches because none of them were the real origin. They were only distorted echoes, external reproductions of an internal ruin. But the end was always reserved for the place where his self was undone for the first time. The building, located at the industrial edge of Portland, is a simple concrete structure with no front windows, a facade that seems to hide more than it reveals. Years of abandonment have layered it with dust, graffiti, and creeping vegetation, but its shape is still recognizable. A central corridor opening into a large ritual hall, flanked by two smaller rooms once used for individual practices. When the team arrives, the sun is already low. The slanted light reveals recent marks on the floor, not scratches or deep footprints, but displaced dust, a subtle trail indicating someone spent hours going in and out. He is there, and he did not flee. Liz observes the partially open door, as if the author himself were allowing entry. There is no sign of forced entry, no trap. He does not want to hide anything. He wants to be found exactly there. The team enters with calculated movement. There is no dialogue between them, no weapons raised, only attentive sensory presence. The air smells of aged wood and old wax, as if time itself had stopped inside that space. The first room is empty except for a sensation of waiting, a dense type of silence that precedes revelation. It is in the main hall that the confrontation begins. The large door is ajar. Inside, the light does not come from lamps but from openings in the roof, filtering in vertical beams. And there, in the center of the room, is the most faithful reconstruction yet. The same circle of candles from the churches, the same white masks aligned on the floor, the same distance between tripod and center point. But there is something different, something the team senses instantly. The center is not empty. There is a wooden bench, simple and low, perfectly aligned. On it, a white mask identical to the others, but facing upward, as if waiting for someone. A silent invitation for the team to understand the final message. He is going to place himself in the center that was always meant for him. And then the author appears. He does not emerge as a threat. He does not run. He does not hide his face. He simply walks through the side corridor with slow steps, like someone walking toward a memory, not a crime. His face is uncovered, but it is not alive. It carries an empty expression, not of coldness, but of absence. The typical expression of someone who lost identity long before the first violent act. He stops before the circle of extinguished candles. He does not look at the team. He looks at the center, at the bench, at the mask. Liz steps forward, not as confrontation, but as mirror. She immediately perceives that the author does not see three investigators. He sees shadows, observers, perhaps former instructors, perhaps projections of the people who fragmented him. He is living in two temporalities at once, the present of the room and the past it represents. It is then that the psychological dynamic of the confrontation emerges. He does not speak, but his posture communicates intention. His shoulders dropped, his body slightly leaning forward, like someone about to surrender to the ritual that always consumed him. He is ready to occupy the center, not as the author, but as the final victim. MINDTRACE sees this instantly. He does not intend to attack. He intends to conclude, to seal himself inside the symbol. Jay interprets the posture. He does not resist because resistance is not part of the narrative. He does not want to confront the world. He wants to confront his own absence. Mark notices another detail. His hands tremble slightly, but not from fear, from expectation. He does not fear being captured. He fears not completing the symbolic cycle. For him, there is no difference between police officers and past spiritual leaders. Both are witnesses to what he became. Liz knows what she must do. Not interrupt, but redirect. Intervene not in the body, but in the narrative guiding that body. She takes a slow, respectful step and positions herself not as authority, but as an observer of the center, as if acknowledging the distorted right he carried through his entire life. Her posture says, "I see what they did to you." And that, paradoxically, disrupts the ritual, because the author was never seen, never recognized as someone wounded, only as someone to be shaped. The air shifts. He hesitates, And in that hesitation, the confrontation reaches its psychological climax. The killer brings his hand to the bench, touches the mask meant for himself. He could put it on. He could close the cycle with his own death. That would be the ending coherent with his trauma. But something new happens. He pulls back by a centimeter. Just that. A minimal movement, but enough to reveal that for an instant the ritual lost strength. In that moment, the confrontation fully establishes itself. Not between agents and criminal, but between him and his story. MINDTRACE understands that the final gesture will not be physical. It will be symbolic. And to prevent him from destroying himself, or someone else, they must remove from him the role of protagonist of the void. They must displace him from the center. Liz does exactly that, not with force but with presence. She walks slowly to the edge of the circle, touching one of the extinguished candles with the tip of her fingers. The gesture is intentional. She interferes with the symbol. And by interfering, she breaks the coherence of his narrative. He notices, he feels it, and falls to his knees, not in submission, but in symbolic collapse. The mask in his hand drops to the floor, rolling slowly until it stops in front of the bench. The team advances not like officers surrounding a criminal, but like professionals preventing a survivor of deep trauma from destroying himself inside his own ritual. He does not resist, does not fight. He simply repeats a familiar pattern. He implodes inward. The confrontation ends not with violence, but with emotional dismantling. And when they finally lead him out of the room, he looks at the empty center, the same one that always haunted him, as if seeing, for the first time, that he did not need to occupy that place. Part 9. The capture, for a common criminal, is the abrupt moment when the escape ends. But for someone like him, someone shaped by a life of erasure, capture is not rupture. It is continuity. There is no struggle, because there is no direction. He is not trying to escape. He is trying to conclude an internal narrative that was written long before any crime occurred. When MINDTRACE removes him from the building of the hollow path, he shows no resistance, no surprise, no fear. His expression remains neutral, with short, almost imperceptible breaths, as if part of him were still in that central room, in front of the mask he never managed to place on his own face. There is something broken, but not violent. Something silent that unfolds in invisible layers. The local tactical agents waiting outside expected a physical confrontation. They expected shouting, running, explosive instability. But they find only a man walking in small steps, as if each movement were carefully measured so as not to disturb the internal order of the symbol he carries. The absence of resistance confuses some, but MINDTRACE understands perfectly. He is not being captured. He is being removed from the center of the ritual he created himself. The first stage of capture is physical, light handcuffs, standard protocol. But for the team, what matters is the psychological capture, a still fragile interruption of the internal narrative that kept him moving. Liz notices the most subtle detail. He does not look at his cuffed hands. He does not look at the police. He does not look at the team. He looks at the ground as if his eyes were searching for the traces he left there inside, in the wind, in the dust, in memory. During the walk to the police vehicle, something significant happens. He stops, not by order, not in resistance, but in confusion. He turns his face toward the abandoned building and, for an instant, seems to try to understand why he is no longer inside, as if the outside world did not belong to the original narrative he had constructed. Jay watches closely. This is the collapse of narrative coherence, the moment when the internal narrative is confronted by external reality and finds no way to adjust. Mark then whispers to Liz, he's outside the ritual for the first time. That sentence defines the entire capture. Inside the vehicle during transport to the temporary facility, the killer remains motionless. He does not try to speak. He does not try to explain. His hands, despite the cuffs, maintain a subtle rhythm, an intermittent tremor that does not express nervousness, but muscle memory. He repeats involuntarily the gesture learned in symbolic submission practices, the movement of putting on and removing a mask. The hand rises, hesitates, falls, rises, hesitates, falls. It is an automatic cycle, a remnant of years of conditioning. The team does not attempt to interrogate him there. Not because he is dangerous, but because he is still in a functional dissociative state, a liminal place where words have no meaning yet. He needs to be slowly extracted from the internal liturgy that governs his mind. At the central precinct, the capture takes another form. The transition between symbolic correction and legal responsibility. Local authorities observe, without fully grasping the depth of the case, as MINDTRACE conducts a silent and respectful process to prevent his mental state from collapsing again. When he is transferred to a reserved room, Liz decides to initiate the minimal stabilization procedure, a psychological intervention not aimed at confession, but containment. The room has neutral lighting, with no glare and no deep shadows. Objects have been removed. There are no symbols that could feed any narrative. Only space, a chair, and human presence. He enters and sits, without instruction, without hesitation, as if he were accustomed to occupying places designated by others. This behavior confirms one of the most painful parts of the profile. He does not know how to occupy a place that is not imposed. He does not know spontaneity. His identity was conditioned to obey narratives authored by others. Liz remains silent beside him, observing not the body, but the breathing pattern. His breathing alternates between superficiality and long pauses, like someone who does not know whether he is allowed to exist in that space. There is a moment when he lifts his eyes and looks directly at Liz. It is not a look of aggression, nor of search. It is an empty look, but not hostile. A look that asks, without words, what role am I supposed to play now? This is the moment that confirms beyond any doubt that capture is, for him, only the transfer of the ritual, not its interruption. Jay enters next. He observes the author's posture, tries to interpret the dissociation pattern. He notices a detail almost everyone else would miss: the way the killer's feet touch the ground. There is no firmness, no grounding. The feet hover slightly, as if he fears occupying too much space. Mark approaches the imaginary circle around him, a symbolic boundary the killer seems to carry with himself. There, Mark understands. He does not feel entitled to exist outside the narrative that destroyed him. And at that point, the capture becomes more than a police procedure. It becomes psychological anchoring. To prevent him from returning to the symbolic state, the team does what the old doctrine never did. It returns to him the recognition of subjectivity. Not through questions, but through presence. There is no pressure, no interrogation, no demand for speech, only attentive observation. And that is what slowly breaks the last layer of the ritual. When the formal transfer to federal custody finally occurs, the killer does not react. But the moment he crosses the threshold of the temporary cell, he stops again. The gesture is minimal, but full of meaning. He touches the inner wall with his hand, as if testing reality. The cold surface gives him something he had not felt in years: boundary. Not a boundary imposed by doctrine, but a physical, concrete boundary that does not require symbolic submission, only existence. It is the first time in the entire investigation that something genuinely touches his awareness, and MINDTRACE notices. Jay whispers, he's feeling his own body. This changes everything. The capture is no longer just containment. It becomes, for him, the first real experience of a boundary between internal and external worlds. The first sensation that he exists outside the ritual. The first perception that his life does not have to be dictated by the void that consumed him. He sits in the cell, breathes deeply, and for the first time, the trembling in his hands stops. The internal narrative dissolves. Identity, though fragile, reappears. MINDTRACE watches in silence. They do not celebrate. They do not dramatize. They simply understand. They did not capture a monster. They captured someone who tried to survive his own erasure and got lost in the process. And that is how the capture ends, not with noise, not with violence, but with a man finally outside the empty center that pursued him his whole life. Part 10. In the end, the faceless congregation case is not remembered only for the white masks, the silent churches, or the meticulous choreography of the bodies. It is remembered for the profound revelation it brought to the surface. Behind every symbolic crime, there is always a pain that never found language. A pain that tried to survive by being erased, and that, in the absence of care, reorganized itself as ritual. MINDTRACE understands that the killer was not born in the moment he took lives. He was born years earlier when someone took his identity. The crimes were only the delayed echo of a collapse that began in silence. And as the team reconstructed each scene, each symbolic choice, each repeated gesture, they realized that he was not seeking destruction. He was seeking meaning, a distorted and desperate attempt to give coherence back to his own past. The white masks, which for the public became symbols of horror, were mirrors to him. They represented the experience of being treated as an empty surface, a moldable container, someone whose story could be discarded in the name of an illusory promise of rebirth. The rope around each neck was not an instrument of violence, but a raw metaphor for the pressure he felt, while being guided into doctrines that demanded absolute emotional submission. The extinguished candles, repeated scene after scene, were perhaps the most devastating symbol. Each one represented an unfulfilled expectation, a light that never ignited, a promised revelation that never arrived. In every church, the empty center was the altar of abandonment, the space where he waited to be transformed and found only silence. In understanding this, MINDTRACE realized something even deeper. At the heart of every crime that attempts to destroy identities, there is always a destroyed identity. This case exposed the fragile line between spiritual search and emotional manipulation, between healing and erasure, between rebirth and disintegration. It showed that when vulnerable people seek answers in structures that promise to kill the ego, they are often simply trying to survive their own pain, and end up delivered into methods that push them even farther from themselves. The killer, now in custody, represents not only someone who took lives, he represents the extreme end of a collective trajectory of neglect toward invisible scars. He is the final product of a system that turns fragility into an opportunity for exploitation, that sells transcendence while dismantling subjectivities. He is the reflection of an era in which the promise of starting from zero is sold as a universal solution to complex traumas, when in truth it is the opposite. For MINDTRACE, the ending is neither victory nor defeat. It is understanding. It is the recognition that their work is not merely to capture criminals, but to illuminate the dark places where pain becomes ideology, where identity unravels, where silence becomes symbol. And as they look at the empty churches, at the hollow center, at the tripod aimed at nothing, the team understands. What he sought was never there. The ritual would never save him. The void would never offer meaning. The only thing that could have rescued him, humanity, was the one thing he did not receive at the most critical moment of his life. That is why, upon closing the case, Liz records in her final report a sentence that echoes not only as a conclusion, but as a warning. When the world tries to erase someone, the void that remains will always find a way to exist.